Have you ever woken up with a profound sense of defeat before the day has even begun? It is a heavy, invisible anchor tied to your chest, pulling you downward into a spiral of assumed failures and preemptive exhaustion. You lie there in the quiet of the morning, running through every possible negative outcome of the tasks ahead. The mind, desperate to protect itself from disappointment, begins to construct elaborate fortresses of pessimism. You tell yourself that preparing for the worst is simply being realistic, that expecting failure softens the blow when it inevitably arrives. But in doing so, you are subtly poisoning your own well. Your body responds to these thoughts not as distant possibilities, but as immediate physical realities. Your shoulders tense, your breathing becomes shallow, and a quiet panic settles behind your eyes. And this is the insidious trap of chronic negative thinking. It does not merely predict a bleak future, it actively creates it by draining the energy, creativity, and resilience needed to overcome challenges. When we view the world through a lens of impending doom, every minor setback becomes insurmountable proof that we are destined to fail, and every opportunity is disguised as a dangerous trap. We become architects of our own misery, locked inside a prison built entirely of our own persistent thoughts. Yet the mind is a landscape that can be deliberately cultivated. Just as it can learn to automatically generate despair, it can be trained to recognize the light. To understand how this profound shift occurs, we must examine the story of a man who nearly lost everything to the shadows of his own mind, only to discover the quiet, a life-altering power of a single redirected thought. Arthur was a man who lived his life anticipating the breaking of things. He was a master horologist, a maker and repairer of intricate mechanical clocks, operating out of a dusty, narrow shop in the older district of the city. His hands possessed decades of hard-won skill, yet his mind was a relentless engine of catastrophe. Over the years, the industry had changed, bringing in cheaper, faster, and more modern competitors. Instead of adapting, Arthur had retreated into a shell of bitter certainty. He believed his business was doomed, his skills were obsolete, and his remaining customers were simply waiting for an excuse to abandon him. This internal narrative was a constant, deafening hum in his ears. When the shop bell rang, he did not hear opportunity, but he heard the arrival of a complaint. When he looked at a complex repair, he did not see a puzzle to be solved. He saw a mechanism that would inevitably humiliate him. This chronic negativity seeped into his physical reality. Because he expected to be exhausted, he slouched over his workbench, compressing his lungs and starving his brain of oxygen. Because he anticipated hostile interactions, his face was perpetually set in a defensive scowl, which in turn made his customers uncomfortable and quick to leave. The most devastating consequence, however, was in his hands. The beautiful, fluid precision that once defined his craft had been replaced by a rigid, anxious hesitation. He gripped his tools too tightly, fearing a mistake so intensely that his own tension caused the very slips of the screwdriver he was terrified of making. And every scratched brass plate or snapped spring was immediately categorized in his mind as absolute proof that he was a failure, entirely washing away the memory of the thousands of gears he had perfectly set in his lifetime. The turning point approached during the bleakest winter of his life. Arthur had been commissioned to restore a highly complex, antique astronomical clock for a wealthy collector. It was a lucrative job, enough to save his failing shop for another year, but the pressure was immense. For 3 weeks, Arthur stared at the dismantled pieces on his bench, paralyzed by the absolute certainty that he would ruin it. He spent hours running through disastrous scenarios in his head, visualizing the collector's anger and his own public ruin. One evening, his hands shaking so violently from stress that he could not even hold his magnifying loupe, he threw his tools against the wall in a fit of despair. He locked the shop and walked out into the freezing rain, wandering the streets until he found himself seeking shelter in a large, brightly lit glass structure at the edge of the city's botanical gardens. It was a conservatory run by an old acquaintance named Julian, a botanist known for cultivating rare and difficult species. Julian was a man of immense calm, moving through the humid green aisles with a quiet, deliberate grace. Arthur sat on a wrought iron bench, dripping wet, and poured out his miseries. He spoke of his failing business, the cruelty of changing times, the certainty of his ruin, and the impossible, cursed clock sitting on his bench. And he described his life as a mechanism with a broken mainspring, destined only to wind down into silence. Julian listened without interrupting, his hands gently repotting a vibrant fern. When Arthur finally fell silent, exhausted by his own tirade, Julian walked to the back of the greenhouse and returned with a small, cracked terracotta pot. Inside it was a single withered stem of a rare climbing vine. Its leaves were brown and curled, and it looked entirely devoid of life. Julian set it on the bench beside Arthur. "I found this in the basement of an old estate," Julian said softly. "It had been kept in the dark for months. The people there said it was dead, that the cold had killed its roots, and it was a waste of time to try and save it." Arthur scoffed, wiping the rain from his face. "They were right. Look at it. The stem is brittle, and you can't reverse rot, Julian. You are wasting your time." "That is exactly what the plant believes," Julian replied, his voice entirely serious. "It has internalized the dark and the cold. It has stopped pulling nutrients from the soil because it expects to freeze. But I know that the roots are still intact. The problem is not that it cannot grow. The problem is that its environment has convinced it that growth is impossible." Julian pushed the pot closer to Arthur. "I want you to take this back to your shop. Put it in your front window where the morning sun hits. Water it once a week. But more importantly, every time you look at it, you are forbidden from thinking about it dying. You must look at the dead stem and actively visualize a green leaf uncurling from the wood." Arthur thought the request was absurd, or an insult to his practical, mechanical mind. But he was too tired to argue. He took the pot home and placed it on the sill above his workbench, primarily to prove Julian wrong. The first week was an exercise in deeply ingrained frustration. Arthur would look at the dry stick, feel a surge of pessimistic vindication, and then catch himself. He felt ridiculous trying to project life onto a dead twig. Meanwhile, the astronomical clock sat in pieces, mocking him. He sat down to begin the delicate reassembly of the escapement wheel. Immediately, the familiar tightness gripped his chest. "The pivots are too worn," he thought. "My hands are too unsteady. I will snap the arbor, and the whole mechanism will be destroyed." His breathing grew shallow, and his vision narrowed. Then, his eyes flicked to the withered plant on the sill. When he remembered Julian's strange demand, he realized, with a sudden, uncomfortable clarity, that he was doing to himself exactly what the dark basement had done to the vine. He was creating an internal environment so cold, so dark, and so devoid of hope that his own skills were going dormant. The shaking in his hands was not a loss of ability. It was the physical manifestation of his terrifying expectations. Arthur put his tools down. He closed his eyes and took a long, deep breath, forcing his lungs to expand fully for the first time in months. He decided to treat his mind like a mechanical system that needed recalibrating. He identified the negative thought, "I will ruin this piece." He actively, forcefully replaced it with a grounded, positive truth. "I have repaired hundreds of escapements. I have the knowledge, and I have the time. I will work slowly, and I will succeed." He opened his eyes. The shaking in his hands had not completely vanished, but it had lessened into a manageable tremor. He picked up the tweezers. He focused entirely on the shape of the brass, the angle of the light, the exact physical pressure needed. He did not let his mind project into the future. He kept it anchored strictly in the present moment of creation. The wheel slotted perfectly into place. The transformation was not magical, nor was it swift. It was an agonizing daily battle against decades of neurological habit. Every morning, Arthur had to actively fight the urge to wake up in dread. Every time the shop bell rang, he had to consciously unclench his jaw and replace the thought of an angry customer with the expectation of a pleasant encounter. And he began to monitor his internal monologue with the same ruthless precision he used to inspect watch gears. When he caught a negative spiral beginning, he stopped it. He visualized success. He visualized the clock ticking perfectly. He visualized the customer smiling. Weeks turned into months. A subtle but profound shift occurred in the atmosphere of the shop. Because Arthur expected better interactions, he greeted people with a guarded but genuine warmth. Customers, sensing the shift from hostility to welcome, lingered longer, asked more questions, and brought more repairs. The heavy, oppressive silence of the workshop was replaced by the steady, rhythmic sounds of productive labor. His posture straightened. The chronic pain in his neck subsided because he was no longer bracing for an invisible impact. One morning in early spring, when the wealthy collector arrived to inspect the astronomical clock. In the past, Arthur would have been a sweating, stammering mess, apologizing for non-existent flaws before the man even spoke. Today, Arthur stood tall beside the workbench. He pulled the velvet cloth away with steady hands. The clock was a masterpiece of restored engineering, its complex dials tracking the sun and moon with flawless, silent precision. The collector was mesmerized, praising not just the craftsmanship, but the renewed vigor and confidence of the craftsman himself. After the collector left, leaving behind a handsome check that secured the shop's future, Arthur sat at his bench. He felt a deep, unfamiliar sensation settling in his chest. Peace. He looked up at the windowsill. The terracotta pot sat in a beam of sunlight. From the side of the supposedly dead and brittle brown stem, a single perfectly formed bright green leaf had unfurled, reaching toward the glass. Arthur reached out and gently touched the leaf, realizing that he, too, had finally stepped out of the dark basement of his own mind. He had not changed the world, but by changing how he expected the world to be, he had fundamentally altered how he moved through it. The lesson of this story lies in the profound psychological truth that our thoughts are not merely passive reflections of our reality, but active architects of it. The concept of positive thinking is often misunderstood as a naive denial of hardship or a refusal to see the world's difficulties, but in truth, it is a rigorous, demanding discipline of the mind. When we chronically expect failure, we experience a psychological phenomenon known as a self-fulfilling prophecy. Our anxiety causes physical tension that creates mistakes. Our pessimism blinds us to viable solutions, and our defensive posture pushes away the very people and opportunities we desperately need. By consciously shifting our internal narrative, we rewire our cognitive focus. We move from a primitive state of threat detection to a higher state of opportunity recognition. This transformation does not happen overnight. It requires the relentless, consistent effort of catching a negative assumption before it takes deep root, and deliberately replacing it with a constructive, empowering, and factual alternative. It is the arduous daily work of pruning the dead branches of your own mind so that new growth can catch the light. When you master the discipline of your own thoughts, you cease to be a helpless victim of circumstance and become the deliberate author of your own experience. Master your mind's expectations, and you will inevitably master the trajectory of your life.